Good afternoon and happy November to you. Yes, November 1st, 2023. The year is fleeting. 2 more months until 2024, and the lunacy of the election year is looming, no doubt about it. This is your holy host thanking you for tuning in to today and to listening to Politics and the Pulpit here on your hometown station. The show where we look at the world through the lens of God's infallible word. I believe we have another great show for you today. At the bottom of the hour, we'll be joined by Alexander Haberbush with the Lex Rex Institute. Alexander has been very busy the last few shows where he normally would be here the first Wednesday of the month. He has been aptly substituted by Deborah Pauley, who is supposed to be calling in today. But Alexander called me and said that he is taking a little break from John Eastman's 2020 election trial. And so he'll be calling in at the bottom of the hour, and we'll talk to him a little bit later as well. I want to get right into today's show and begin by talking about the left's attack against the new House Speaker, Mike Johnson, and how the left's framing of him segues into the issues involving our children in schools today. To give you a bit of a taste of just how the left loathes Bible Christianity, here is former White House spokesman Jen Psaki on her very low-rated cable show talking about the faith of Mike Johnson. I want you to listen to this as Jerry plays it, if you will. It's about a 4-minute clip. We're not going to play all 4 minutes, but I'll play enough for you to get a little flavor of where the left, exactly where the left is when it comes to biblical Christianity. Jerry.
Right now, one deeply religious conservative Republican is limping out of the race for president after failing to gain any traction whatsoever. Another deeply religious conservative Republican just ascended to the speakership and is now second in line to the presidency. One of the key differences between Mike Pence and Mike Johnson is, Pence refused to go along with Donald Trump's efforts to overturn the election in 2020, while Mike Johnson was a key architect of that plot. Apparently, there is still a place in the Republican Party for extreme Christian conservatism, so long as it's paired with a fealty to the former president. So let's take a few minutes to talk about this new speaker. First glance, Mike Johnson does seem fine-ish. Conservative, yes, but he once started a civility caucus with a Democrat. And I mean, if nothing else, he wears a suit and has glasses. How threatening can this guy actually be? Well, he gave us all a little clue as to how he would govern in an interview this week.
I am a Bible-believing Christian. Someone asked me today in the media, they said, it's curious. People are curious. What does Mike Johnson think about any issue under the sun? I said, well, go pick up a Bible off your shelf and read it. That's my worldview.
You heard that right. The Bible doesn't just inform his worldview. It is his worldview. In fact, during his first speech in his new job, Johnson suggested that his election as speaker was an act of God. Talk about a bit of a humble brag there. So what exactly has God apparently called on Mike Johnson to do? Well, his views on policy are essentially what you'd expect from a religious fundamentalist. They're more divisive than they are divine. Prior to his election to Congress in 2016, Johnson spent nearly 2 decades working for the hard right.
Well, if you listen to the rest of it, it's another 3 minutes of snark. You can listen as Psaki attempts in framing Johnson's Christian faith as some sort of Christian fascist or far-right Christian nationalist. She, of course, is aghast that a Christian would actually have a worldview that is, Christian? It's totally shocking, right? That a Christian would actually have a Christian worldview. And I agree with Mike Johnson, or at least Jen Psaki's characterization of Mike Johnson. The Bible doesn't inform my worldview. The Bible is my worldview. And by the way, that can be misinterpreted because obviously when it comes to my worldview, being the Bible, that of course needs to be understood within its own context, which is rightly divided and rightly handled correctly. Because obviously there is things in the Word of God that don't have application for right now, don't have lawful application right now. And then there are some things that do. And of course, most people don't understand those things, because as soon as you say that the Bible informs my worldview, they automatically want to go to those passages that other leftists have pulled out of the Bible, probably from some rank imitation of the King James Bible. And we'll quote from the New Living Translation or something like that and talk about, you guys want to stone disobedient children or kill homosexuals. Well, I can say that that was definitely something that was done under the Old Testament covenant. However, I will also qualify by saying I can't find a passage where either one of those things were done. But the fact is, folks, there is no doubt that Mike Johnson is a dedicated Bible-believing Christian. And I think for those of us that sweated out the last 3 weeks and maybe had a little bit of animosity towards Matt Gaetz initially, uh, I'm going to just say this. It's very possible we might have done better with a Mike Johnson. And we'll see. Only time will tell. Obviously, I'm a results-oriented kind of guy. And just because he is a Christian doesn't necessarily mean he is not going to buckle and not going to say some things and not going to vote for some things that are going to totally irritate me. We have to understand that as Christians, we can have liberty to disagree with some people on some issues. We don't have to have across the board fealty and allegiance to other Christians. We can have the liberty to disagree on some things. And I am sure, because Mike Johnson is human and I am human, that I'm not going to agree with everything that he is going to do and every piece of legislation that he's going to put forth. So just because he's a Christian doesn't mean I'm going to always agree with him. But I do think it is funny if you read leftist publications, which basically means everything in the mainstream media. Many of them describe Johnson's Christian faith as, quote, fascist. Of course, I'd still love to turn to one of these journalists and say, could you define for me right now what a fascist is? Or, of course, they'll say he's a far-right Christian nationalist. Now, of course, if you just say Christian nationalism, that would already by extension be far-right. But, of course, they have to add far-right because it gives it a little bit more sting. And they all just seem to use the same talking points depending on the publication. So you're going to see the reusing and the recycling of these terms like Christian fascist or far-right Christian nationalism. The great Rush Limbaugh used to say that a memo would go out to the talking heads, and they were all forced to parrot the same talking points in print and on TV in order to establish and cement a narrative about someone or something. And then Rush would do a quick montage of a minute or so of all of the Sunday morning shows and how all the liberal talking heads basically parroted the same talking points. Because why? They're trying to establish and cement a narrative about someone or something. Now, to be fair, this is done on both sides, but the left is just frankly much better at it. Now, Psaki goes on to mock Johnson by saying, and what passage precisely states that Johnson was chosen for his position by God? Because if you listen to Mike Johnson's address to the House last Wednesday, he says that he was chosen by God to do what he is about to embark on. And of course, Jen very snarkily says, what passage precisely states this? Well, Jen, it's Romans 13, verse number 1, which states this: let every soul be subject unto the higher powers, for there is no power but of God. The powers that be are ordained of God. Now, allow me to just briefly offer some exposition for those of you out there that may not understand the very clear King's English. When it says, "For there is no power but of God," that means whether you are a bad leader or a good leader, you are there because a sovereign God has allowed you to be in that position. And then the verse goes on to say, the powers that be are ordained by God. Yes, you and I make choices. Yes, you and I pass legislation and things of that nature. But really, it is God who ordains these individuals. I hate to say this, Barack Obama was ordained to be where he was. Now, we're not talking about in a Calvinistic, fatalistic, no free will kind of ordained here, but we are talking about the fact that God is in total control and that God knew that Mike Johnson would be speaker. And so, Jen, it's Romans 13:1. Now, how utterly shocking, a Christian actually citing and believing a Christian source, aka the Bible. But the left is scared to death of not so much Mike Johnson, but I do believe that the left is scared of who is indwelling Mike Johnson. You see, to the secular left, church is great and your faith in God is great, so long as everything you believe about church and the Bible remains sealed in that building where you worship each Sunday. Church and the Bible is bad, especially to the left, when you actually do and live out your biblical convictions the rest of the week, and when the Bible actually is your worldview when you look at candidates and when you consider legislation and when you look at propositions and when you make daily decisions about your family, about everything. So, how does this all apply to our schools, you might be asking? Well, because the left is attempting to frame an argument concerning Johnson that is broader, if you will, a broader framing and a broader attack on Christians more specifically. Now, you understand when they attack Mike Johnson and say he is a, quote, Christian fascist or he is a far-right Christian nationalist, you understand that they're actually attacking broader Christianity in general. They're not just attacking Mike Johnson. When they write an article saying that he is akin to a Ned Flanders on The Simpsons, where he's, he's got the glasses on, he seems to be very jovial and funny and kind of even keeled, but in reality, he's this fomenting fundamentalist that wants to go after everything. The fact is, that is the left's view of modern biblical Christianity. See, they're going to tell you exactly who they do not like and what exactly they disagree with. They're going to be very clear, very honest all of the time. And might I add, you should believe them. Now, again, how does this apply to the broader question of Christians and our public schools and our children? Well, let's ask a series of questions. Who is better at parenting your children? You, mom and dad, or the state? I think the answer is very logical. Mom and dad. Who is better at parenting? Mom and dad, or the school system? I think the answer is very logical. It's mom and dad. But we're kind of living in a time, especially in the last 40 or 50 years, where both parents are working. There was a time that I'd love to go back to that, of course, the left thinks is a horrible time, when dad was the one who brought home the bacon and mom stayed at home and was a homemaker and took care of the kids. I know that's a time in which, to the left, is very, very scary. But because, for instance, we live in a state like California where $50,000 doesn't really do you justice in terms of a livable income, you've got to have a mom and a dad bringing in dual incomes, and this doesn't allow mom or doesn't allow dad, whoever is going to bring in the income, to stay home and educate their kids, which is what parents did decades ago. Now we've entrusted them by and large to these state-run schools where they are devoid and get, if you will, educated out of what their parents have taught them at home. And then, of course, at school, they are then told the exact opposite of what their parents are telling them. But the left wants to frame the argument in such a way that schools are a safe environment for kids and homes are somehow unsafe, intolerant, and abusive. The left is also good at rebranding a bill. Take, for instance, the bill in Florida from about a year ago that essentially made sure young kids in schools were kept from seeing pornographic content in school textbooks. You all remember that. Seems like common sense, right? I don't want my kids in 3 or 4th or 5th grade to see any kind of pictures that are suggestive, whether they're legitimate or just drawings. But it seems like common sense. But Governor DeSantis was on this, and rightfully so. You all remember this. So what does the left do to divert the collective attention away from the common sense purpose of the bill? They rebrand it and call it the, quote, "Don't Say Gay Bill." And then Disney and all of corporate America jumps on board with the left in order to push this agenda and push this narrative. And the left is doing the very same thing in our schools by rebranding a student wellness bill into a, quote, "Don't Forcibly Out My Kid" bill. Parents, do not let them do this. The left wants to take the common sense out of this student wellness bill and make it about Christian nationalism, Christian fascism, and whatever else the left cannot define. Parents, you need to show up tonight, if you're listening locally, at 6 p.m. to the Hart School Board, and on November 15th, when this particular policy is actually going to be spoken of and, Lord willing, voted on, to make sure we keep our elected officials accountable to us, the people who elected them. When we come back on Politics in the Pulpit here on your hometown station, we'll be joined on the phone with Alexander Haberbush from the Lex Rex Institute here in beautiful Long Beach, California, when we return on your hometown station. All right, we're back here on Politics in the Pulpit. This is your holy host, the Bishop of Santa Clarita. It is good to have with us online, calling from somewhere in Long Beach, I'm assuming.
That's right.
Alexander Haberbush. I
Yeah,
understand,
thank you for having me
Alexander,
again, Jerry.
you are getting married or about to get married. Which is it?
I am about to get married. That's right. On November 10th, I'm getting married to my longtime interest, Kristen Jones, who is actually now a legal secretary here at Lex Rex. So there'll be even more Haberbushes in the business.
So that means that if the secretary is in your office in a few weeks, it's okay.
That's true.
That's great. Well, obviously, in your absence, Alexander, and we'll talk about why you're absent in just a minute, you've been a little busy, to say the least. But,
to say the least,
yeah. But you have been substituted aptly by Deborah Pauly, and we have enjoyed our conversations over the course of the last several shows where you have been unable to call in. But
and we've been very blessed to have her on our staff here. She's been a tremendous help in our litigation. You know, she has a huge background in conservative activism, and that has served her extremely well working as the staff attorney at Lex Rex.
Yeah. Real quick, I didn't talk about this earlier, but I wanted to just get your quick take on this. If you don't have any information, don't worry about it, Alexander. But obviously, we know that the states of Colorado and Minnesota are attempting to use the 14th Amendment to keep Trump off of the ballot.
They're trying to.
I'm just wondering what your thoughts are on the legitimacy of that going forward.
It is laughably absurd. You can quote me on that. It is laughably absurd
I'm going to quote you.
that actually they did in the Epoch Times a couple of weeks ago. There was a lengthy article where my opinion was asked on just that subject, and I told them the same thing. They're looking at the sedition clause of the 14th Amendment, which pertains both to crimes that Trump has not been charged with. Because if you look at what he's being charged with in each of these different criminal indictments, none of them are anything akin to sedition or treason. I mean, in New York, it's basically white-collar crime. In Mar-a-Lago, it's mishandling of documents. And then in Georgia, it's, conspiring to impersonate public officials because of the elector scheme where they had their Republican electors meet. It's nothing even close to treason or sedition. I know that people like to use that word, I guess, because it sells newspapers better, but that is not accurate as to what Trump's even been charged with. And then, in addition to that, to kick into effect the 14th Amendment sedition clause, he would need to actually be convicted of one of those crimes. Well, it's not sufficient to be charged with it. So he hasn't been charged, let alone convicted, and it's not even the right crime.
Yeah, considering you're an attorney, and for the sake of our listeners, Alexander, would you just give us a legal definition of what sedition is?
Oh, gee, you're testing my bar exam knowledge here, but it's basically statements that would undermine the security of the United States.
Yeah, and obviously, this is completely ridiculous for them to interpret those clauses in either Colorado or Minnesota in keeping Trump off of the ballot.
Well, there is an actual federal crime called sedition.
Sure.
You can't just pick these other crimes that have been charged and say that they're the same thing as sedition, because that's just not what he's been charged with, and he won't be charged with that because there aren't facts to support a sedition charge.
Absolutely. Well, as I mentioned at the bottom of the hour, you'd been noticeably absent the last several shows, and of course, aptly substituted with Deborah Polley, but you have been kind of connected with the trial of Attorney John Eastman, the
That's
whole
right.
2020 debacle, if you will. I know you're not at liberty to really get into all the details, considering that's an ongoing trial. I'm going to go ahead and quote the White House. We can't say anything because it's an ongoing trial. But
exactly.
But what can you say about this that would not compromise anything?
Yeah, well, I am one of Dr. Eastman's attorneys on this matter. I can say that it was originally slated to end in June. It's still going on. I think the closing arguments are currently scheduled for this Friday. You can tune in. Anybody can watch that. There's a Zoom link to it. If you can't find that, you can check out either Lex Rex Institute's Facebook page or our website. We'll have a link to that Zoom link so that you can watch that. You might want to check out closing arguments. That's going to be Friday. Don't want to spoil anything, so I guess I'll leave it at that. But needless to say, when a trial goes, what is it at this point? 3 months over? 4 months? June, July, August, September, October. Yeah, I guess almost 5 months over at this point. Needless to say, that impacts my schedule a bit.
And do you think that makes the opposite side look better or your side look good?
Well, I'm not going to comment too much on that. I will say that obviously in this sort of a case, the prosecution presents their evidence first, and that was the component that took a lot longer than we expected.
Sure.
So naturally, the defense is going to be longer to be proportionate with that.
Well, obviously, since the last time we spoke, we have had all kinds of things happen in the House. We had, we've had, Kevin
none
McCarthy.
of my clients making big waves. Matt Gaetz got rid of the Speaker of the House. We're actually representing him on a case. It's a free speech case that's out here in California where a couple of cities tried to cancel events on him, basically because they didn't like his viewpoint. Yeah,
well, obviously, we had 3 weeks without a speaker, and I actually said at the top of the hour that even though many of us were kind of gritting our teeth for the 3 weeks, we might have come out on top with a pretty good House Speaker in the name of Mike Johnson.
I know.
And I'm wondering what your thoughts are about Mike Johnson. And obviously now, here we are, less than a week after his seating as House Speaker, that he is being attacked as a far-right Christian fascist.
Well, that just means that he's a conservative that's not going to immediately cave like a lot of the rest of them. Yeah, I've met Mike. I've met him once before in person. He came off as very genuine and very sincere to me. I think he believes the things that he says. He strikes me as a real, genuine conservative. which, considering that was the reason why we removed the last speaker in the first place, I think that constitutes a victory.
I completely agree with you on that. I want to talk a little bit about the 2020 election. Obviously, you know a little bit about that, considering that you are with Attorney John Eastman. Do you see a distinction between someone called an election denier, and I'll give you an example of that in a minute, and an election questioner? And I'll just go ahead and put my cards out on the table and say,
sure,
I'm kind of an election questioner. And the reason why I say this is because well, let me rephrase that. Maybe I'm somewhere in the middle, the mushy middle of that, because I still remember watching the election results of 2020 with my wife, and there was that hiccup in Pennsylvania, Michigan, and the other state there where they said they were going to stop the count. And I remember looking at my wife specifically and saying, they're going to steal this election. And it was, all those states, Trump was up the night of, but then slowly, obviously the tally started coming in and they all ended up towards Biden. But Hakeem Jeffries, who tried to be the heir apparent to Kevin McCarthy the last 3 weeks, there are at least 13 times where Jeffries denied election results. In fact, I'll just name a few of them.
Yeah.
He said, quote, there's a cloud of illegitimacy around the election of Donald Trump because of the fake news industry. Quote, he said the legitimacy of the 2016 presidential election was, quote, in doubt. He says Trump was an illegitimate president or a Russian asset. And of course, I can go on and on and on. Why does a guy like Hakeem Jeffries, and I think I already know the answer to this, but let's just have a conversation. Why does a guy like Hakeem Jeffries get to just slide? And the Times and the New York Times, they just come to his defense and say, well, this is wrong for the right to suggest that he's an election denier. But yet, if I say, I got some real problems with 2020, and yet I'm the bad guy. What's going on?
Well, I think part of that may have to do with which side he's on. There may be a double standard at play there, and I'm deliberately understating that because I think we all know that's the real answer. But, I actually want to say I think his claims are a lot more extreme than what those who are questioning the legitimacy of the 2020 election have claimed. And I guess I can talk a bit more about this now because my name actually did come out in testimony during John's trial the other day. So I guess now it's a matter of public record that I worked with John in 2020 on behalf of the president. But, as somebody who worked on behalf of the president, I don't think that I was ever denying the outcome of an election.
Sure.
I don't think President Trump was denying the outcome of an election. And that's not, there's two important reasons for that. There's a less important reason and a more important reason. The less important reason is, well, there were credible allegations of fraud, irregularity, illegality, violations of state law, things of that nature that made our claims credible, plausible, and I still think largely correct. But the more important answer to that is that, regardless of how the media might talk about it, our election is not said and done on election night. There are other steps that must be gone through, other people who must approve of an election's results. I mean, the most well-known of which is obviously the Electoral College. We do not vote for president directly. We vote for electors who then meet and vote for the president. But there's steps in addition to that. The governor of the state certifies what the Electoral College has done and sends that to Congress, where it is opened by the president of the Senate and read before both houses of Congress. Under the Electoral Count Act, there was a procedure for challenging the electors that were submitted by each state. The reason for that is not just because we like to have Rube Goldberg devices for election of our president, which is the way that the left likes to present it nowadays. The reason we have that is because historically, succession of your chief executive has been an extremely dangerous thing. I mean, that's the reason why you have kings in countless countries throughout history, because if you can't trust who's going to put the next guy in power, well, at least we can agree, if we can all agree that it's going to be the previous guy's son, at least we know who that is. And there won't be a civil war when we get our next leader. Well, that's the reason why we have so many different people in our system, most of whom do not have any direct involvement in our political process, especially electors, specifically cannot hold a position of trust or profit in the United States. And the reason why we have those stages is so that we know that an election result is correct, even if it ends up being different from what the states initially reported on election night. And when you have somebody like Congressman Jeffries coming out and saying, despite all of these steps happening, Trump is still an illegitimate president, well, that's a dangerous and extreme statement. Because even if you don't like what happened with social media, it is still unquestionably a legitimate electoral outcome because all these different entities signed off on it. And unfortunately, when we look at 2020, we can see that what happened on election night may be corrupt as all get out. I think unquestionably there were states that did not comply with their own laws, which renders their elections per se invalid. But you did have approval by those state legislatures. They did not question it. It went through both the House and the Senate. The vice president read those votes, and Joe Biden was validly proclaimed president. I have no problem calling him President Biden. I think he shouldn't be. I don't know that he's rightfully in office, but he was certainly elected through a process that legally put him in power. So we do not question his legitimacy at this point. We just question whether or not the election was conducted with integrity.
I think everything you just said right there needs to be brandished in gold, because I think the distinction between what is an election denier and an election questioner is very aptly stated in what you just said. During the break, I was talking to you about the book I read a couple years ago that was, I think, a New York Times bestseller by Molly Hemingway called Rigged.
Yeah,
and it's a great book, and I highly encourage anybody who is interested in the whole 2020 scheme to read Molly Hemingway's book. And she is still featured on Fox News at the moment and has been on some other other news sites. But basically, she outlines and says that things were put in place in 2020 because of COVID and other things that essentially almost guaranteed the outcome that we had in November of 2020. What say you?
I think that's right. No, I think that's right. And the real thing that was ignored in 2020 that fortunately I think is understood a little bit better now in 2023 is that the state legislatures have the plenary power under our Constitution to determine the manner in which their electors are appointed. We cannot have ad hoc modifications to state election law made often in collusive lawsuits with the Democratic Party. The Democrats would sue the Secretary of State saying, we want you to change election law. And then the Secretary of State wouldn't even contest the suit. They just enter into a stipulation saying, sure, we'll do what you want. That's a collusive lawsuit, in my opinion. But now at least we have some understanding of the state legislature controls that manner, not the Secretary of State, not the governor, and certainly not the Democratic Party. But that was not at all what we saw in 2020. In fact, it was an uphill battle just to inform the different state legislators that they had the power to take back an election when it had failed.
Yeah. Well, obviously, we know that Mike Pence threw in the towel on Saturday, announcing
That's
to
right.
a bunch
I was happy to hear that.
Yeah, I figured you were. Do you think that Mike Pence has basically sold his soul for a more, sold his soul to somebody, and that's why basically from this point on, he's just not going to have any major support within the Republican Party? Do you think the Republican Party has changed so much and has become a little more, if you will, populist, that a guy like Pence just won't gain any traction?
I hope so. And all my comments today are on my own behalf. They're not on behalf of John or any other of my clients. But I think that his failure to do what was needed and what his constitutional oath of office required him to do, I think is just unconscionable. And the fact that he would have the gall to run for president of the United States when he had shown himself manifestly incapable of stepping up and doing what's required of him under the Constitution of the United States. The fact that the voters rejected him is something that I could not be happier about.
Well, we only have about a minute and a half here, Alexander. I want to ask you this question. Do you think that Mike Pence will endorse Donald Trump? Obviously, Trump asked for it.
Only time will tell. I mean, he's been very critical of President Trump, while also trying to ride on his coattails to some extent. It was kind of a schizophrenic campaign in that way. I hope he does. I don't wish the guy ill at all, and I hope that, I would like him to see the error of his ways and to come around. I just don't think he has any business running for president.
One last thing, and I'm going to give you the last word on this, Alexander. What do you say out there to a bunch of Christians whether they're Reformed, fundamentalist, middle of the road evangelical, whatever stripe they tend to be, that just can't quite muster it to vote for President Donald J. Trump should he become the Republican nominee. What does Alexander Haberbush have to say to that group of Christians?
Well, you might not like my answer, but my answer is you always have to vote your conscience. Now, I strongly disagree, and I would like to have a conversation with anybody who believes conscience dictates against Donald Trump, because I think there are very sound reasons why he is exactly the president that America needs. But you always got to vote your conscience. Don't go against conscience.
I agree with that, and I'm going to leave it at that because, well, Alexander, you're far more, well, let's put it, educated than I am on those issues. So
I don't know if that's true.
Well, listen, Alexander, God bless you as you get married here in a little over a week, and I do wish you well as you're on your honeymoon, and Lord willing, everything goes well with the Eastman trial.
Thank you very much, and good talking to you again too, Jerry.
God bless you. Great talking to Alexander Haberbush with the Lex Rex Institute. If you're interested in the Lex Rex Institute, you can find them online. They are a pro bono organization that will help churches, individuals, Christians, whatever the case might be, especially if you're harassed by a left-wing government. When we come back here, we'll give you the final word on Politics in the Pulpit here on your hometown station. All right, we're back here on Politics in the Pulpit for our final segment today, and you're listening to your hometown station, 98.1 and AM 1220. I wanted to just take the last few moments of the show to just speak my heart out about an issue that is very near and dear to me. And it's in reference to what is happening in school, on school campuses and in school boards, not only here in Santa Clarita, but across the United States of America. The way the left is trying to frame this is the way the left tried to frame the abortion bill in 1973, Roe versus Wade. One of the things they tried to do was say, we need to pass Roe v. Wade because of rape, incest, and the life of the mother, which, if you read the stats, all the figures make it very clear that abortion, by and large, is not because of rape, incest, or the life of the mother. It's because, well, you get an abortion because you just want to get an abortion. And that's ostensibly the way it is today, and the left, for the most part, doesn't hide that. But the way they passed Roe v. Wade was, well, we have to because of rape, incest, and the life of the mother. And the way they're trying to frame this issue with our kids is that if we do tell parents about the identity of their child at school, whether Sam is Samantha at school or Samantha is Sam at school, that if they happen to have Christian parents, that somehow the Christian parents are going to, quote, beat them over the head into submission with their holy Bibles until they turn back straight. Folks, that is like so silly. It is pathetic. And do not let the left frame the argument and frame the narrative for you. I have been a Christian since the age of 13, and I have been in ministry to some, whether pastoring for 22 years or in ministry generally for over 25 years. I am very familiar with Bible Christianity of just about every stripe. And this notion of a pastor and a child going wayward is something that is not only biblical, if you read Luke chapter 15 with the prodigal son, or if you read in the Old Testament with Absalom and David and other accounts, of course, you can find in the Bible. But I have a pastor friend who I've known for a very, very long time, over 30 years, who has several children, and one of his children, who grew up in the church that he pastored, ended up identifying as a gay man. And now that son lives somewhere up in the northeast of the United States. Now, I don't know every instance of what is happening in this particular pastor's life with his relationship with his son, But I can tell you some things as a matter of fact. He did not get his son psychologically analyzed. He did not take his son to counseling to somehow strip him of his gayness. There was no electric shock treatment that was done because as believers, as Christians, we don't believe that this is something you're born with that can be electrically shocked out of your system. We believe that something like this is part of your sin nature, your Adamic sin nature, and you make a choice. And I know the left hates that because it busts their narrative about being born that way. But I will say that there is a slight semblance of truth of that phrase, being born that way, because every one of us is born in Adam's likeness with the potential to commit just about any sin you can think of under the sun. And so I want to just say that this pastor that I've known for well over 30 years still loves his boy, still fellowships with his boy, interacts with his son, and tries to support his son in a lot of ways, but is very clear that he disagrees with the lifestyle of his boy. Now, this pastor is not an anomaly, because I know of other pastors who have had similar situations happen with them, whether with a daughter or a son, and no electric shock treatment, no gay therapy, whatever these guys try to say, none of that. I have a gay cousin. He's still my cousin. I still love my cousin. But I can genuinely disagree with him without any issue. At least I hope. And so I think it's important for the Bible-believing community to understand that there is a way to handle this, and it's not the way the left is framing the narrative. The left doesn't like anything that has to do with conservative Christian fundamental values. And I want to say this too in closing. I do not believe that many of them are looking out for the interest of our kids. If what the left is saying is true, that we just need to let them follow their desires, then maybe the suicide rates would go down. And they haven't. They've remained high. They've remained high. And folks, I think it's important that you show up tonight and on November 15th to the Hart School Board meeting. And I think you need to be calm. You need to be cool. You need to be collected. Why? Because you represent someone greater than yourself. You represent Christ. You represent your church. And you represent some convictions that the left, barring a work of God on their heart, would never and can never understand. And so I would really encourage you to be present tonight at 6 o'clock and on November 15th at 6 o'clock as well. This is Pastor Cook, the Bishop of Santa Clarita, saying goodbye, and we'll see you next Wednesday on Politics in the Pulpit on your hometown station.
You've been listening